I'm a professor at the University of Washington, a professor of wildlife science in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, and I'm also the principal investigator for the Predator Ecology Lab that I'll talk about in just a minute. But first, I sort of wanted to set up this talk a little bit for you today. I've titled my talk, Deer Are Also Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, and that, based upon the introduction we just had, that sort of exemplifies the kinds of questions that I tend to ask about the roles that large predators play in ecosystems. Basically, I'm more interested in the effects that they have on other species and their environments by scaring other species than by killing and eating other species, right? So today's talk is going to explore whether deer are afraid of wolves, and if so, how they respond to the threat of being attacked by wolves. I also want to emphasize two other things. I'm using the term big bad wolf here. I do not mean that to imply that I think wolves are bad. Wolves are really important ecosystem players, but I incorporated this phrase into the title because it illustrates sort of the kind of long-term impact that gray wolves have had on our own imaginations. In fact, the term big bad wolf arose originally in Aesop's fables, which date back more than 2,500 years ago. So gray wolves have been capturing our imaginations in part because of the fear they inspire for thousands of years. And the talk today is going to explore whether they also inspire fear in some of their prey species. And I also want to say that the purpose of me being here isn't so much to talk about my research, but rather to satisfy any curiosities you might have about gray wolves and their interactions with prey species, and maybe particularly how they scare prey species. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the talk about that topic or any of the other predators that I study, and I will field those as best I can. Okay, and now on to the next slide. So I mentioned before that I'm the principal investigator for the Predator Ecology Lab. In that lab, my grad students and I are interested in questions about, again, the ecological roles large predators play, and we focus on large predators in both terrestrial or land-based as well as aquatic or marine-based ecosystems. We're, of course, also interested in applying our research findings to facilitate the conservation and recovery of these species, many of which are imperiled. So let me just give you a broad survey of some of the species that my graduate students and I focus on for our research. First, in the top left, I have an ongoing study of interactions between brown bears and Pacific salmon in Alaska. One of my students also studies snow leopards that you can see pictured here, top center, in Central Asia. I work with a number of Australian collaborators on the dingo, which you can see top right. This is the largest terrestrial apex carnivore that Australia has. Bottom left, I work with colleagues in French Polynesia on reef shark ecology. And bottom right, starting when I was a PhD student back in 2002, spent a long time studying the ecology of tiger sharks, particularly in Western Australia. If you were interested in any of those animals or others, I'm happy to address questions about those as well. But today we want to focus on wolves and their prey. Before I go into wolves, I want to address a question I often get when I sort of run through the various predator species that my students and I study at the University of Washington. And that is, how did you end up studying all these large predators, these diverse predators in so many different ecosystems? And the answer goes back a long way. So the picture you can see here is actually one that I drew as a fifth grader when I was living in Pakistan, actually. And it's of killer whales, then and still my favorite animal, pursuing a variety of different prey species. So you can see, even when I was a young kid, I was absolutely fascinated with documentaries showing predator-prey interactions, and I sought to understand and to draw those interactions myself. And I remember having a lot of conversations with my parents about how I would go on and be a predator-prey ecologist. And so I set and then I dedicated myself to getting the education and the experiences that enabled me to actually have a research program dedicated to large predators. And here I am today. So I bring all this up just to emphasize to you that you can actualize what might seem to be sort of unattainable goals, including working with big predators. And the way to do that, I think, is to have a strategic focus on achieving that goal very early on. Okay, so let's get back to wolves and their prey. Since I started at the University of Washington in 2008, I've been working with gray wolves. The reason, as I'll go over in just a minute, is that my arrival at the University of Washington in Seattle in 2008 coincided with the reappearance of gray wolves in the state of Washington after an absence of about 70 years. And given my interest in large predators, in particular large predators that are both fascinating and controversial, I knew I had to begin studying gray wolves right away. This picture here actually comes from a trail cam, or a motion-activated camera, that we deployed at one of our study sites in Eastern Washington. And I love it because it just sort of captures the essence of wolf. It almost looks as if the wolf is stalking the camera. But importantly, as I mentioned earlier, my research program isn't just about large predators. It's about their interactions with prey. And so today's story is going to focus on these large canid predators in Washington, but importantly, it's also going to address their interactions with their major prey species in this state. And we'll get to them in just a minute. Two different species of deer, right? So this isn't just a predator talk, this is a predator-prey talk, a wolf-deer talk. But first, let's go over a little bit of the history of wolves in the continental United States, and in particular in the Pacific Northwest and Washington. So as you can see from this figure here, historically, at least up to the time of European colonization, the gray wolf had a very broad range throughout the continental US, basically sort of the western 2/3 of the country. And if anybody's curious, just as a little aside, the lighter tan color in the eastern third of the United States was actually the domain of a completely different wolf species, a wolf species that was native or endemic to North America. So the gray wolf that occupied the western 2/3, the darker yellow shade there, actually came over from Eurasia, and it collided in the eastern continental United States with a native wolf species, the eastern wolf, Canis lycaon. So anyway, an interesting factoid to add. But of course, we're focusing on the gray wolf here. So again, at the time of European colonization, they had a broad geographic range, but because of a systematic extermination campaign, by about the early 1900s, wolves had been extirpated from that entire western range, with the exception of a small remnant population in the north central United States, that western Great Lakes population that you can see here highlighted in red in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and a little bit of Michigan. So wolves always remained there, but were eliminated from the rest of the lower 48 states. Then in the mid-1990s, because of a change in attitude toward wolves and some dedicated reintroduction campaigns, wolves were brought down from Canada and released into the greater Yellowstone ecosystem in Wyoming, as well as into central Idaho. And they were also allowed to naturally colonize northwestern Montana. And that's that sort of red glob there you see in the northern Rockies region of the northwestern United States. And subsequent to those reintroductions and that allowed natural recolonization, wolves have been expanding ever since. And as I mentioned earlier, by about 2008, wolf packs had begun moving of their own volition, not having anything to do with people, into both Washington and Oregon. And a few years ago, a wolf pack even established itself in Northern California. So the wolf reintroduction that brought wolves back to the Western United States was a great success. And wolf numbers and wolf distribution continue to expand subsequent to that reintroduction. So this is a very happy predator recovery story. So now let's zoom in on what's going on in Washington. So on this slide here in the top right-hand corner, you can actually see a camera trap or motion-activated camera photograph of the pups of the very first wolf pack that was documented to have been occupying, to have recolonized Washington State in 2008. This was the Lookout Pack, which was photographed very close to the city of Twisk, Washington, if anybody is familiar with that. And since the recolonization of that first lookout wolf pack, wolf numbers and the number of wolf packs have been growing steadily, as you can see from this figure here. And I promise you, this is the last piece of hard data I'm going to show you. But I wanted to add it in here just to illustrate to you that just like wolves are expanding through the Northwest United States, they're also rapidly expanding in the state of Washington. In fact, if you can see, at the time of the most recent count in 2019, there are now somewhere between 120 and 100, maybe 150 wolves in the state of Washington, and somewhere between 20 and 30 packs. So wolf recovery in Washington is going well, and their numbers have expanded fairly rapidly since their initial return in 2008. Now, this return of wolves sets up a really exciting opportunity for scientists like me, right? Because those of us who had been doing research in Washington prior to the return of wolves have sort of before or baseline data of how ecosystems functioned before the return of this top predator. And then we could compare those data to what things are looking like now that we have wolves back in Washington, right? How is the prey behavior changing? How are ecosystem dynamics changing, right? How are human economies changing? These are all questions that I and others are addressing at the various universities in Washington now that we have this top predator back in our state. So we can go on to the next slide now. So this is another figure that I've derived from sort of ongoing wolf monitoring by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. They do a really nice job of compiling year-to-year changes in wolf numbers and wolf distributions. The blue polygons here are pack locations and the boundaries of pack territories starting in 2012 and all the way into 2019. And the major take-home, there are two take-homes I want you to get from this slide. First of all, is that although wolf numbers and wolf packs are expanding in Washington, they tend to be concentrated in the northeastern corner of the state. We call that a sort of saturated area of Washington. It's sort of been fully recolonized by wolves. They filled up most, if not all, of the available space that was there for them in that part of the state, but they've only just begun to expand into the other area that's been designated by the state of Washington as habitat for wolf recovery that you can see here shaded in tan. We only have a small number of packs basically pushing westward, and it's forecast that it might take another 5 years or more for wolves to fully utilize the rest of the available habitat for them. So there are lots of changes that are still going to happen with respect to where wolves are and how many wolves we have in the state. But if you kind of go back to north central and northeastern Washington, we have a situation where they have largely recovered, and therefore we can start the process of understanding how they are reshaping their environments potentially. So for my study, here highlighted by the red square, this is where my graduate students and I began working on the ecology of these recolonizing top predators starting in about 2012. So this is an area known as the Okanagan Highlands, which straddles lands that are managed primarily by the United States Forest Service and lands that fall within the Confederated Colville Tribal Reservation and are managed by their Fish and Wildlife Department. And so now we have a really cool Google Earth zoom in that's going to take you on the map to basically the hub of where we worked in Eastern Washington. Basically, our research area was centered around the small town of Republic, which sits right at the boundary between the Forest Service lands to the north and Colville tribal lands to the south that you can see here. And looking down upon this landscape, one thing I want to impress upon you is that this is really quintessential wolf country. It's a mountainous landscape with a lot of forest cover, but because of the topography, you have a lot of valleys which are more open and feature the kind of flatter terrain that's being rapidly recolonized by wolves because the landscape properties are very conducive to them being successful in terms of finding enough prey, forming packs, and having a number of offspring. All right, maybe get back to the slides. On the next slide, I've got a picture of the landscape as it looks, not from the bird's eye view provided by, or the satellite view, I should say, provided by Google Earth, but rather the on the ground view of somebody taking a photograph from a promontory. So again, this is what I mean, right? You have a mountainous landscape with a lot of topographical variation, a fair bit of forest cover, but enough open areas that you can see there down the valley where wolves might do prey. Okay, so on to the next slide. Where did we set up shop to conduct a study of the impacts of wolves on deer? You have a map, right? You can see Washington, you can see where I work, and then the larger panel is sort of zooming in on the immediate landscape of the Okanagan Highlands. And the thing I want to point out here is that we set up 4 different study areas, right? All about the size of an average gray wolf pack territory. 2 of these territories, as you can see here, shaded in blue, fell predominantly within the Colville Reservation. These areas were occupied by the Strawberry and Inseetson wolf packs. If anybody's interested, the word Inseetson is their word for wolf, which is very cool. I think Salish for wolf. And then to contrast with those 2 study areas, we set up 2 adjacent study areas where wolf packs were absent. And so this study design basically allowed us to compare 2 areas that were the domain of gray wolf packs with 2 areas that wolf packs had yet to recolonize. And this setup allowed us to ask whether the behavior of deer differed in the areas lacking wolves relative to the areas where wolves were present. Or in other words, it was sort of a pseudo-experimental attempt on our part to say whether any differences between the 2 areas with and without wolves could be attributable to wolves, right? Our inference was if deer did differ in the areas with wolf packs, then those behavioral differences were probably attributable to the renewed presence of gray wolves. Okay, so importantly, in all 4 of these areas, there were large numbers of 2 different prey species, potential prey species for gray wolves. 2 different deer species, mule deer on the left and whitetail deer on the right. Now, importantly, these are both species that gray wolves are known to target as prey. They're both highly abundant ungulate species or hoofed mammal species that we have here in Washington, and they're very commercially important game species for humans here in Washington. Both are hunted. They both look quite similar, and the main diagnostic feature that you can use to tell them apart is actually their tail. As you can see on the left, the mule deer's tail looks like it's been dipped in black ink, whereas the whitetail deer's tail has no black on the tip and is much larger and fluffier, right? Has a very fluffy white low bottom side. So again, if you see deer when you're cruising through eastern Washington, look to the tail as the diagnostic feature that will tell you whether it's a white-tailed deer or a mule deer. The other thing I want to impress upon you here is that these 2 deer are similar in size. They're relatively similar in diet, although not identical. But there is a key difference between them that led us to expect going into this study that they might respond very differently to the renewed presence of wolves on the landscape. Okay, and to get to what that difference was and how it sort of shaped our expectations for how they might basically manage the danger of wolves or respond to this new threat of wolves with altered behavior, we first want to talk a little bit about how wolves hunt, and then we want to talk a little bit about how both of these deer species run away. So first on the next slide, I've got a picture taken by Dan McNulty, Professor Dan McNulty, who at the time was working in Yellowstone National Park, of gray wolves pursuing another ungulate species, an elk. This picture does a very good job of exemplifying or illustrating how wolves pursue their prey. They are a pack forming, right? They form packs, and then they course or they seek to run down prey as a group. So they are endurance hunters. Wolves spend large portions of every day basically keeping an eye on their prey. And when they start to initiate a hunt, what they is to get prey running, individual prey or groups of prey running. And that's very critical, because what that allows them to do is observe each prey individual, looking for signs of weakness, malnourishment, disease, injury, deformity that would make their potential prey easier to catch. And the reason that they're looking at prey so closely like that is because the life of a wolf is hard. They're not very big. You know, a typical wolf in Washington might weigh about 100 pounds, and they're often targeting prey species, especially when they're going after an elk, that are 5 times their size or more, or they might be targeting a moose that's 8 to 10 times their size or more, right? And these prey species don't go down without a fight, right? They have antlers and they have hooves that they can use to defend themselves. So it's really important for wolves, so as to not sustain injuries themselves or even be killed during a hunt, that they target an individual that's vulnerable and easier to catch. And they can do that by getting prey running, and then they can sort of start to tire prey out, and it gives them time to identify any particular prey individual that looks to be more vulnerable. Because it's very important that they attack those vulnerable individuals so that they don't have to expend all their energy pursuing prey, and they avoid injury themselves. Well, what kind of landscapes might allow wolves to get prey running and might facilitate wolves running prey for long periods of time? In fact, during chases, wolves have been documented chasing prey for as many as 10 kilometers, or about 6 miles, right? These are long chases, wars of attrition, if you will, during which wolves are able to spot weaknesses, right? So you can probably come up with a guess about what kind of landscape would allow wolves to initiate these kinds of chases, right? Open landscapes where the terrain is relatively flat, relatively gentle, with few obstacles, few obstructions that allow wolves to pursue their prey over long distances, right? Areas that are densely forested, or where the topography is uneven and broken, like mountain slides and steeply sloped areas, are not very good for wolf hunting. So they are looking to find prey in areas where the terrain is relatively flat, because those areas are really good for launching the kinds of chases that are going to result in wolves ultimately capturing prey. The last thing I want to say about this slide, which really illustrates how tough it is to be a wolf, is that under the best circumstances, only about 1 in 5 wolf pursuits ends in a capture. So 4 out of 5 times they fail. And during some times of the year, it could be more like only 1 in 10 chases are successful. And you know, if you're doing a long chase, that's a lot of energy wasted, right? If you don't successfully capture prey, right? So again, that just really underscores the importance of wolves finding the right circumstances in which to launch an attack. Okay, with that in mind, with wolves coursing predators that are looking for flat terrain to launch chases that have the highest chances of being successful, let's now consider how these two deer species get away. So I said before that they are morphologically very similar. They're built very similarly, but they have a very different way of running. So white-tailed deer on the top are gallopers, like elk or horses or zebras, right? They basically have a nice, even gallop, right, where they kind of cruise across the landscape, as you can see from the pictures there. And that allows them to attain a very high rate of speed, okay? But only if the terrain is flat. Right, basically, when you gallop, and that you can sort of envision maybe horses, thoroughbreds racing in a horse race, right? They need a flat terrain so they can really get into a good galloping rhythm, right? Like a horse going fast. And so to effectively get away from predators, white-tailed deer do really well on flat terrain. But the situation is radically different for mule deer. Mule deer actually bounce. They have a completely different running gait. They can gallop, but they're not good at it, right? Structurally, their bones and their musculature are actually built to bounce, right? So you can see from the picture here, they kind of bounce up and down with all their legs hitting the ground simultaneously. And they can bounce over very long distances like this. This is a gait called stotting or bounding, okay? This gait is terrain. You could envision that if you're running over flat terrain, you would want to get into a fast sprint or a gallop. You wouldn't want to bounce up and down like you're on a pogo stick. That doesn't make any sense at all, right? But on uneven terrain or broken terrain or terrain where there's lots of obstacles, bouncing is highly advantageous because it can allow you to bounce left and right and over obstacles, over crevices and things like that, right? So for mule deer to effectively get away from predators, if they're exposed to danger, if they're exposed to the threat of an attack, we might expect them to actually seek a very different landscape than what whitetail deer would seek, right? We would expect whitetail deer to maybe seek flat terrain, and we might expect mule deer to select sloped, steeper, rugged, broken terrain that actually suits their means of getting away from wolves, right? And this is all under the idea that when either one of these two deer species is confronted by the renewed presence of wolves, they would have an interest in not being captured by wolves and continuing to survive, right? And we see this throughout the animal kingdom, right? Prey animals aren't just static targets sitting on the landscape for predators to eat. They don't want to be eaten. And so most prey animals, like deer, take very great pains not to be eaten. And that's really the essence of my research program, is understanding what prey species actually do to avoid becoming a meal for a predator. Well, when you have deer species that rely on running away to get away from a predator like wolves, we might expect that when they're all of a sudden exposed to this new predator on the landscape, they'd move to the area that best suits their ability to run away. So our prediction was, in the areas with wolves, whitetail deer might increase their use of flat terrain, and mule deer might increase their use of sloped, steep, broken, and rugged terrain, suiting their respective running gaits. Okay, so on the next slide, to put that to the test, starting in 2012 every winter, as you can see from this next slide here, what we did is we actually needed to devise a means to capture and instrument mule and whitetail deer with tracking devices, because you can't sit out there on the landscape, if you recall that earlier picture, and watch these deer interact with wolves. It's too rugged and it's too forested, right? So we needed what we call a remote method of tracking the movements of both the wolves and the deer. Well, fortunately, our project partners with the Colville Confederated Tribes already had members of the wolf packs collared. And they were generous enough to allow us to use their data on wolf movement. So we already had good data on what the wolves were doing, and we had to fill in the gap by illustrating what deer were doing in response to wolves, and in the area where wolves were absent, where there would be no reason to fear wolves, right? Because they're not there. So to capture wolves, as you can see from this slide here on the left, we use what's called a clover trap. This is a collapsible trap with soft netting on the side. What we do in the winter when deer are hungry is we'd set these traps out where we knew deer were moving through, and we'd bait them with a lot of delicious goodies like molasses and apples and alfalfa to entice the deer to go in. And then there's basically a spring-loaded treadle that they step on when they're in the trap, and that causes the door to close. And these traps also had transmitters that would then send us a signal saying, there's a deer in the trap, you need to go get it. So we'd immediately venture out there no matter what time of day it was, and we'd check the trap. And the trap is configured such that when you pull a few strings, it actually falls over and kind of nets the deer nice and gently. It's a really ingenious way of making sure that the deer gets basically netted and does not injure itself or any of the researchers while struggling. So it's a really quick, effective, and humane way to catch deer that you want to equip with tracking technology and then release. If any of you are thinking that it might be rough for a deer to be in a trap like this, maybe for a few hours before we get there, keep in mind that we loaded these traps with all kinds of goodies. And we actually found that sometimes when deer were captured, they immediately wanted to go back in the trap as soon as people left, because it was a really, really sort of nutritious foraging opportunity for them. So we didn't have any evidence that deer didn't like being in the traps, but rather that they might come to view the traps as a good feeding opportunity, okay? So Once we caught a deer, what we would do is we'd equip it with a global positioning system collar like the one pictured here. What these collars do is they stay on the deer for about 3 years and then fall off. And in that time, they communicate up ahead, relaying the deer's position every 4 hours or so, right? And then the satellite relays that location on the landscape to us in our lab at the University of Washington. So we basically just get to sit there in our armchairs and amass all sorts of data about where the wolves are and where the two species of deer are on the landscape over the course of 3 years, right? And then with all those data, we could ask whether deer movement patterns and use of different terrains, right, differed in the areas with wolves from the areas without wolves. And if those differences were consistent with our predictions, right? Did white-tailed deer push more to flat terrain, and did mule deer push more to steep terrain to be safer from wolves, right? Okay, let's go to the next slide. What did we find? Well, over the course of 3 years, from 2013 to 2016, what we found is that our prediction was mostly, but not completely right. Okay, the situation was a little bit more complex, specifically in terms of what white-tailed deer were doing. So the image you can see now on the left characterizes what both deer did in the two study areas that lacked wolves, right? These were our sort of control areas, our wolf-free areas, where deer were presumed to be safe from wolves and therefore had no need to adjust where they were on the landscape to better resist or be able to escape from pursuing wolves, right? And what we found in those two wolf-free areas is that mule and white-tailed deer actually broadly overlapped in space. They both mostly spent their time down in the flat valleys where the terrain was gentle, okay? And one of the reasons for that is that the plants on which these two deer species feed, particularly in the winter, are more abundant at lower elevations, right? The weather and the snowfall get a little harsher as you move up in elevation onto more sloped terrain, and there are fewer plants there to eat, right? So if there's no need to avoid a predator, these deer basically did what we expected them to do. They targeted the best food down in the valleys near water, right, near rivers and other bodies of water, where they could find the best food to eat. Makes the most sense. But now let's advance to what the deer did in the areas where they were actually exposed to wolves. So if we go to the next slide, something really interesting happened, right? Mule deer, as you can see from the graphic, right, they, as we predicted, pushed upslope where the terrain was more broken and rugged, exactly as we expected, right? Their distribution changed significantly to use much more of the kind of landscapes that wolves don't like to use to hunt, and where mule deer are better able to get away using their bounding or stotting tactic, right? Bouncing over boulders and crevices and obstacles and things like that. So mule deer did exactly what we expected them to do. White-tailed deer didn't do much at all, but it actually makes sense because white-tailed deer were already largely in the areas that featured flat terrain. In other words, they were already in the areas that suited their escape tactic. And so what we found white-tailed deer to do was, instead of making any large-scale movements, they exhibited very what we call small-scale or fine-scale movements. They largely stayed in place, but they did spend in those areas a little bit more time closer to roads and on the flattest terrain possible. So white-tailed deer were responding to wolf predation risk. They were managing their risk, but they were doing so in place locally. They didn't really have to go anywhere. They just slid a little bit toward roads, which are nice flat runways for them to get away, and a little bit more towards open areas and the flattest terrain available, just to make sure that if they did happen to encounter a wolf, they'd have the best chance of getting away. Mule deer, again, on the other hand, they picked up and completely left the valleys and went upslope to more broken terrain. So a much more dramatic response. And one thing this illustrates is that even if you have two very similar prey species, they can respond very differently to the same predator, right? Even if they look almost identical, like mule deer and white-tailed deer. And that's quite a fascinating finding, actually. So if we go to the next slide, let's bring in the plants that deer eat. You might be asking, well, why is this important? Okay, well, one major reason it's important is because deer are very influential herbivores. And on the left, in the areas where wolves are absent, I mentioned that their diets do overlap, but they do target different things. Whitetail deer like willow and cottonwood and aspen a little bit more, whereas mule deer rely a little bit more heavily on shrubs like serviceberry that you can see here, okay? And so on the right, with mule deer sliding up slope, what that means is the plants that they eat are also now experiencing mule deer herbivory in a completely different place, right? Now, instead of targeting serviceberry down in the valley, they're targeting serviceberry, as you can see from the animation here, up higher in elevation, right? And so what this means is that wolves could actually be having an indirect effect on the plants deer eat, and in particular, mule deer eat, by changing where mule deer spend their time foraging, right? Whitetail deer continue to eat willow down in the valley bottoms, but now in the presence of wolves, mule deer are exploiting serviceberry and other shrubs that they like rabbit brush, up in higher elevation areas where the terrain is more broken. And that means that plants that would once have been targeted by mule deer down in the valley bottoms are freed from herbivory. And this could lead to plant community changes in the way the forest looks in the areas that mule deer have abandoned, right? Fascinating possibility that my students and I are still addressing. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, I want to talk very briefly as I wrap up here on another dimension of the wolf-deer relationship that we've been exploring. And that is that the presence of wolves actually, because wolves basically push mule deer up slope, it also seems to change their diet. So another thing that we did with some of the deer we captured is instead of equipping them with a GPS collar, we equipped them with something called an animal-borne camera. This was a camera they wore as a necklace that recorded several hours of daytime footage of the deer as it walked around the landscape for a period of about 2 weeks in the winter. And then the cameras dropped off and we got them and we got to watch all this footage. So you're seeing a 10-second clip of a deer feeding while wearing one of those necklace cameras or critter cams, if you will. And these cameras actually allowed us to see exactly what dietary or feeding decisions the deer were making as they moved around the landscape. And what we found from these animal-borne camera deployments is that in the areas lacking wolves, mule deer and whitetail deer diets were much more similar than they were in the areas that had resident gray wolf packs. And we think this is because the wolf packs pushed mule deer higher upslope to higher elevations where the terrain was more broken. And that led mule deer to target more coniferous species like Douglas fir than they did in the areas without wolves. So another impact that wolves are having on these two deer species is that wolves appear to be driving their diet to be increasingly different. And that might be relaxing competition between the two deer species, right? So without wolves, they're targeting more of the same plants. With wolves, they're targeting increasingly different sets of plants, right? So in that sense, wolves might be making life better on whitetail deer by removing competitive mule deer, but not by killing them, but rather by inducing competitive mule deer to move upslope where they feed on a completely different set of plants. Another fascinating possibility. If we put all this together and bring this home, as you can see from this slide, what all this research really illustrates is that it is very critical to understand what I call the natural history details of predator-prey interactions. Natural history is the way a particular animal leads its life, right? And so this requires very careful science and careful observation to understand all the details of what prey animals do to be able to feed successfully, reproduce successfully, and evade predators successfully. And so what this research has shown us is that to understand how deer respond to wolves, right, we need to understand basically how deer get away, right? And our understanding of the difference in the way whitetail deer and mule deer get away from wolves allowed us to successfully predict differences in their spatial responses to the presence of wolves, right? We knew that whitetail deer are sprinters, and according to our prediction, largely, they stayed in the area where sprinting was easiest in the presence of wolves. But the bounding mule deer, which has an advantage on broken but not flat terrain, they got out of Dodge in the areas where wolves were present, right? Completely relocating to higher elevation areas that had steeper slopes and more broken terrain, right? So broadly, to understand and be able to predict the response of any prey species to the danger of a predator, we really need to have a detailed understanding of the tactics that that prey species uses to get away. And in some of my other systems, this is a very broadly applicable idea, right? We find whether we're talking about tiger sharks and their prey species or wolves and their prey species, that understanding how the prey species gets away allows us to very reliably predict what that prey species will do when confronted with the threat of predation. So at this point, I want to wrap things up by just acknowledging the many individuals and entities who and which made this project go. But in particular, I want to give a shout out to my 3 graduate students on this project: Justin Dellinger, who's now a biologist down in California; Carolyn Shores, who's now a biologist up in Williams Lake, British Columbia; and April Craig, who's now finishing up her PhD. So she's still in my lab. And if we can advance one more time, I also want to give a very special thanks to the Colville Confederated Tribes, and in particular, their Fish and Wildlife Department, who allowed us to work on their sovereign lands, shared their expertise with us, and have just been absolutely marvelous collaborators. To this day, we continue to collaborate with them on various questions pertaining to wolf-prey interaction. So special shout out to the Colville tribe as well. And with that, if we can advance to our last slide here, happily, we still have about 20 minutes for questions. So I'm happy to do my best to field any questions you had. I had to sort of encapsulate a big study in a fairly short span of time. So I'm sure there are many things I didn't get to, and I hope there's some things you're curious about that I can try to address now. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We got a big list of questions here to go through, so let's get started.
All right.
We got a question from Shire. According to your research, do grey wolves usually live in cold, snowy weather?
Oh, I love that question. So, do gray wolves, are they almost always in cold, snowy weather? You know, the gray wolf actually does quite well in a variety of different landscapes. In fact, we find gray wolves all the way down in arid landscapes of the southwestern United States. They once occupied all those areas and extended well down into Mexico and Central America as well. And of course, they are found across much of Eurasia, and you can find wolves in places like India as well, outside of snowy environments. So this is what we would call a highly adaptable, generalized predator that can thrive and do very well in a lot of different environments. But I like your question because although they don't need snowy, wintry environments to thrive, they do very well, very, very well in wintry environments. The reason for that goes back to what I talked about earlier in terms of the way they hunt down prey, right? They invest a lot of time and a lot of energy in targeting prey that are vulnerable. Well, as you might imagine, there are environmental or landscape features that can enhance prey vulnerability. And one of the big ones is winter snow. Not only because winter snow covers up the plants that herbivores need to eat and can basically cause them to lose condition, right? Lose energy reserves, get really hungry and weak. But snow is also very difficult to run through. But if you ever look at a wolf, they have enormous paws. They almost function like snowshoes. So wolves are really good at skimming over the top of deep snow. Ungulates are not, right? With their long legs and their hooves, they punch right through snow. So deep snow and cold winter weather are advantage wolves. So yes, you tend to see this species do particularly well in environments where you get long, cold, snowy winters, because those kinds of conditions render their prey species highly vulnerable and easier to catch. In Washington, for example, we see that wolves struggle a little bit more in the summer because the summer is a time of green up. There are lots of nutritious plants for prey to eat, so they're nice and healthy and strong and can run a long way. And there's no deep snow to bog them down, right? So deep snow is important, it's valuable for wolves, but interestingly, it's not necessary for them. We find them thriving in other environments.
Great. Next question from Lillian. Do you think that grey wolves will start to expand their territory in the next few decades, maybe even closer to central Washington or even the Puget Sound?
Great question. And yes, I do. All indications are that they are continuing to expand. So I showed you that map of showing that wolf packs right now are sort of concentrated in northeast Washington. That makes sense geographically because that's sort of the point of entry into the state of Washington from British Columbia, and in particular from Idaho, right, where there are many, many wolves. So that's just kind of the spillover zone that we're seeing in northeastern Washington. But wolf packs have been expanding south into the Blue Mountains. They've been expanding into central Washington. And there have even been some detections of lone individuals in western Washington in the Skagit Valley, as well as near the city of North Bend, believe it or not. So wolves are making forays into western Washington. And I know biologists with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife anticipate that it will take them about 5 years or so to get down in the Mount St. Helens region, the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest region, and down to the southwestern coast of Washington. And then eventually they can make their way up out onto the Olympic Peninsula, which incidentally was the very last place that wolves occupied in the 1920s before they were extirpated by people from the state of Washington. So yeah, I do expect them, if humans allow them to do so, to fully recolonize Washington. And that will lead to some very interesting scenarios where we have wolves in western Washington, where unlike eastern Washington, they will now be occupying landscapes where there are also lots and lots of people.
Question from Callie. Can you tell by looking at a wolf if it's a girl or a boy?
Oh, great question. Not always very easy to do just by looking. You would have to get a very close look or observe long enough to witness behavior. So yes, from a distance, at first glance, the sex of a wolf can be something that's very difficult to ascertain. There's a little bit of what we call sexual dimorphism or size differences where the males are larger, but it's not dramatic enough to make it easy. So often you would have to catch the wolf to know or make detailed enough observations, right, to determine the wolf from social status or interactions with other individuals. Or one of the best ways is to collect DNA from the wolf, maybe through its scat, right, its feces or something like that. And you can sex the animal that way. So yeah, without the benefit of very close, careful, prolonged observations where you might see genitalia, right, or the animal urinate or defecate, or if you're not able to catch the animal, then sexing a wolf can be quite different, right? You can't necessarily just use size as a differentiator, and there are no coat color differences.
Next question from Blake. How high can a mule deer jump?
Oh, great question. Quite high. I don't know the exact figure, but I do know that mule and whitetail deer can very easily clear a fence that's 2 meters high, right? So that's about 6.5 feet. So they can jump at least that high, quite tremendous jumping ability, perhaps even several feet higher than that, right? So if you want fence that can exclude deer, it needs to be very high fence, more than 2 meters high. They're tremendous athletes.
That seems like a video waiting to hit.
Oh yeah, you can actually find some clips on YouTube of deer just effortlessly bounding over fence. Whitetail deer are pretty good jumpers too. They're actually both Olympic champion jumpers. There's no problem at all clearing a fence that's 6, 7, 8 feet tall.
Question from Sydney. Does the introduction of wolves have an effect on any species other than deer?
Oh, I love that question. So the story I told you, just because of time, was sort of linear and limited to wolves and these 2 deer. But in fact, yeah, what we're trying to ascertain at the University of Washington, this isn't just me, but colleagues and graduate students as well, is the sort of broader ecosystem impacts of wolves on other prey species, right? Like moose and elk, as well as smaller predators like bobcats and coyotes, and other larger predators like mountain lions and black bears. And of course, we also want to understand their relationship. I will tell you so far, what I will tell you so far is that wolves influence the behavior of the other apex predator in Washington state that was always here, that was never fully extirpated, and that's the mountain lion or cougar. But they don't influence them spatially. They influence them temporally, and this is fascinating. So we had cougars in all 4 of our study areas, and they're also important predators of deer. But in the areas with wolves, what we saw with cougars is they didn't relocate spatially, but they became more diurnal or daytime active, whereas cougars are normally more crepuscular or active at dawn and dusk, and nocturnal or active at night. Wolves are also highly active at night. So our conclusion was to basically avoid having to tangle with a pack of wolves, which would be bad news for most individual cougars. Instead of abandoning the area spatially, they relocate in time or temporally, becoming more diurnal. But that could be critical because humans and human hunters who sometimes target cougars are also diurnal. So one possibility is that by pushing cougars out of nocturnal time periods, wolves may actually push cougars into more temporal or time overlap with people, which during the cougar hunting season could result in higher harvest of cougar. That's something that we're considering now. So you can see there's a complex interplay of interactions and reshuffling that happens with the addition of wolves to the ecosystem. And importantly, one of the things I didn't mention, but that's so fascinating about work here in Washington versus, say, wolf research in Yellowstone, is that in Yellowstone, humans are not a major ecosystem player, but here in Washington, they are. In fact, they're a super predator, right? Humans not only target prey, right, for wolves and mountain lions, but they target wolves and mountain lions as well, right? Not so much in Washington where wolves are protected, but in other areas, right, they hunt wolves and mountain lions. And so it's critical that we incorporate humans and their responses and their influences into our studies, right? Because again, they are a major ecosystem player.
We've got a very closely related question here from Sydney. We saw a cougar this weekend. Do you study them, and should we be scared of them?
Oh, great question. So yes, I have a graduate student, Lauren Satterfield, who's studying cougars and their relationship with wolves right now in 2 major study areas, not the ones I talked about today, or the one I talked about today, but rather a study area closer to where that first wolf pack, the Lookout pack, was first documented in Twist, as well as up north of Spokane in the Northeast, that saturation zone. So she's still working up her data, but we aim to learn a lot about everything that cougars do or don't do to cope with this renewed presence of a competing top predator on the landscape. So maybe I'll come back and talk to you about that later. As far as being afraid of cougars, I've given talks all around the world on human large predator relationships, including sharks, wolves, cougars, bears, and so on and so forth. And what I would say is that when you are in their domain, they are always to be respected. You always want to be aware of them, right? Whether it's bear aware or cougar aware. I don't think there's much reason to be afraid of them. In fact, they are far more afraid of you than you are of them. And their normal reaction to humans is avoidance. And that's whether we're talking about wolves, bears, cougars, or even sharks, for that matter, quite frankly. So no, I don't think there's a big reason to be actively afraid of them. But again, whenever you're in the wilderness and you're dealing with wild animals, including large predators, you always want to be cognizant of them or aware of them, and you want to behave accordingly, right? So best not to go out, because again, they are a predator. And although they're not targeting people, there are circumstances where they do occasionally attack people, viewing us as a threat or a potential prey item, right? And so there are things that we can do to minimize the likelihood of that happening, like being in wilderness areas in groups and making noise and being aware of our surroundings, right? Those kinds of proactive measures are really, really effective in reducing and really all but eliminating the possibility of any kind of negative interaction with a predator, right? If you let them know you were there, their response is generally to get out of there. So again, respected, yes, a large predator can certainly be dangerous. Feared, not necessarily. In fact, our greatest weapon is something called neophobia. I was saying earlier that wolves, they hunt in a way that minimizes the likelihood that they're going to get hurt. Cougars are the same way. And if you think about it from a predator's perspective, they cannot afford to get injured. If they are hurt by any prey species, they'll never be able to hunt effectively again, and that will be the end of them. So predators are inherently incredibly cautious, especially about attacking things they're not familiar with. And that's our greatest suit of armor, whether we're swimming the ocean or we're out in the forest. We're not a familiar prey item for these animals. And so they are extremely reluctant to attack. They might be curious, right? Most mountain lion encounters you hear about are actually them showing curiosity or responding to humans as a potential threat, right? Maybe a female defending her kittens, for example. But their lack of familiarity with us largely protects us from attack, in particular if we're loud and we're in groups. It's a tremendous defense, including against bears. But anyway, it's a great question. You want to be aware of them. Any wild animal is potentially dangerous. Especially a large predator, but no, they're not actively stalking people. I wouldn't really advocate being afraid of them. Amazed by them. They're fascinating animals. Maybe you want to be curious about them and aware of them.
Yeah, I'd love to see a cougar near my house. That'd be great. A question from Lillian. There was some recent sad news with Wyoming ranchers killing wolves after they were no longer declared endangered. How does protection for wolves continue as their populations grow, and are there conflicts between farmers and wolves?
Oh, what a marvelous question. So I'm working with some colleagues and grad students on those kind of questions from the human side of things. So humans are also our focal research subjects. We're seeking to learn as much as possible about human attitudes toward wolves, all with the goal of identifying what we call coexistence measures, right? Or happy compromises that allow humans to continue to make a living in wolf-occupied landscapes and also minimize negative interactions between people and wolves, which, as the questioner just noted, often or at least sometimes result in management control, right? Or wolves being lethally removed from the landscape. So to begin to answer the question, look, as with so many other large predators, they can compete with us for wild game. They sometimes do depredate livestock. In rare occasions, they do attack and kill people. And they also inspire a lot of fear, right? They work on our imagination in the same way that they work on the imagination of deer, right? One of the reasons being that we share an evolutionary history with large predators such that in our evolutionary past, there would have been very good reason to be afraid, for example, of nocturnal felids in Africa. And thus, we still have a fear of the dark, which is evolutionary residue, right? So again, there are many reasons that predators are prone to conflict with people. How do we minimize that? Thus far, as the questioner recognized, the protocol has been when wolves get in trouble, for example, by depredating or eating livestock, those problem animals are identified. And if mitigation measures are not successful, if they basically repeatedly offend, then they are lethally removed, right? They are also managed as a game species in a number of areas like Wyoming and Montana, right, where they can be legally hunted. But here's, I think, the happy compromise ending to this. What we're learning is that there is widespread support, even among the ranching community, whose livelihoods can be jeopardized by large predators, in what we call non-lethal proactive mitigation measures. In other words, there are all kinds of things we can do that allow ranchers and other producers in wolf-occupied country, if you will, to be able to continue leading their lives and being successful and having wolves in those landscapes as well. So these non-lethal mitigation measures include everything from range riding, right? Having people basically go ride the landscape on horseback, monitoring livestock, taking advantage of the fact that wolves are scared of people. Livestock guardian dogs can be effective guards against wolves of some livestock species. Fladry or flagging or lighting can be placed around areas where livestock are held, and that tends to repulse wolves. Careful disposal of livestock carcasses is a really effective means, because often what happens is when livestock carcasses are disposed carelessly, wolf packs will make use of them and develop a taste for livestock, and that kind of trains them that near human areas and ranching operations, they can find food that's easier to catch than wild game, right? The best thing right now is evidence suggests that normally speaking, wolves actually prefer to target wild game like elk to livestock. If we do everything possible to dissuade them from switching from live game to livestock, that minimizes the potential for conflict. And the last thing I would say about this is probably the two most important things that we can do is obviously large predators need some open country to occupy, right? So we need to preserve areas where human density is low. Humans don't have to be absent, but human density needs to be low so that predators can roam those areas. And the second thing they need is prey to eat, wild prey, right? So efforts to boost the abundance of wild game species like deer for wolves are probably the very best way to prevent wolves from running afoul of people. So what we're learning, again, broadly to kind of tie it all up, is there are lots of non-lethal measures, indirect and direct, that we can take that I think in the future will minimize the frequency with which wolves have to be lethally removed when they get in trouble with people. It will never go away completely, but we can minimize it.
Well, we've got about 10 questions left, and we've got about -3 minutes left, so we might have to draw a line quite soon. There's one intriguing question that just came up from Lillian, which is there are many stories of people being raised by wolves. Is there any chance this could possibly be true?
Ah, yes. Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book and others. I'm not aware of any evidence suggesting that might be true, but narratively, it's a very intriguing idea. But I like the sort of broader metaphor coming from those kinds of stories about coexistence, right? So I think those stories, even if that possibility is probably not very likely in reality, the message sent by those stories is that it is possible for humans and wolves to sort of coexist in the same landscape. And so those stories continue to have a lot of power. And the Jungle Book was always one of my very favorite stories growing up. So I'm glad the questioner brought that up. Thank you.
How similar is a wolf to a coyote? Do they get along?
Oh, I love that question. Right. So wolves and coyotes do not get along. They are competitors, right? So a coyote is a smaller canid predator. We call it a meso or medium-sized predator. They are on average maybe about a third the size of a wolf, a quarter to a third the size of the wolf. So quite a bit smaller. And that means they tend to target smaller prey, right? More rabbits, more rodents, things like that. Although coyotes, like wolves, can form packs and they can kill deer, believe it or not. So they can, in numbers, be very effective deer predators. And that means that they compete with wolves for deer. And so when they meet each other, what often happens is the wolves chase them off or kill them, not to eat, but just to kill them. Okay, so they're very, very nasty competitors with each other, and wolves being much bigger, they win those competitive tussles. But here's what's fascinating about that question. My colleague Laura Prue calls it fatal attraction, right? So they don't like each other, and wolves will kill coyotes if they're able to do so. But coyotes benefit hugely from scavenging off the carcasses of wolf kills, right? So what you'll often find is even though they could be killed by wolves, coyotes are often attracted to areas that are used by wolves because they can try to sneak in and feed off deer, elk, and moose carcasses when the wolves aren't looking. So it's a very complicated relationship, right? Where coyotes need to be worried about wolves, but they can also benefit immensely nutritionally by feeding off large carcasses of wolf kills from animals that they could definitely they could never kill themselves.
I think
one last thing to say about that is when wolves were extirpated from the western United States, coyotes expanded dramatically and filled the gap or the niche left behind by wolves. So coyotes have benefited immensely from human persecution of wolves, and they are much more numerous now than we think they were pre-European colonization in North America. We think they were excluded and suppressed from a lot of areas when wolves dominated. but now they were highly numerous. So again, a good estimate of wolf abundance in the western United States is really hard to get because we just weren't collecting data back then. But I've seen some estimates that maybe in the west of the Rockies there might have been 100 to 250,000 wolves. Compare that now to what do we have? Maybe 4,000. Okay, and there would have been far fewer coyotes. Now we have just a few thousand wolves, and we have over 1 million coyotes in the West. Historical evidence suggests that coyotes weren't that prevalent at all in the western United States. They may have been absent altogether from many areas west of the Rockies. All right, so consequences to top predator extirpation. One is you get the rise of these smaller predators. So coyotes like us in that regard.
So we got lots of questions that are about the other types of species, but for time, I think I guess we're going to have to stick to wolves this time around. Maybe one last question here is:
okay,
does the wolf have a predator?
Oh, I love that. I love that question. That's a fantastic question. Does the wolf have a predator? Well, you know, we define certain animals as what we call apex or top predators. Based on the idea that this is an animal that once it becomes an adult, at least, doesn't have to worry very much about predation. But the truth is, there's really almost no animal on Earth that isn't under some special circumstances vulnerable to being eaten by something else, and that holds for wolves too. So wolves are the top dog here in Washington, largely because they form packs, which can allow them even to bully mountain lions. But if you have a lone wolf wandering around, they are occasionally killed and eaten by mountain lions. And we have seen that. I think there have been at least 2 radio-collared wolves in Washington that have been killed and eaten by a mountain lion. So under the right circumstances where a wolf is lone, in a one-on-one fight, a mountain lion is a much more ferocious predator, right? They have 5 weapons compared to 1, right? The wolf can bite, but a mountain lion has all 4 sets of claws as well. And they're much bigger and more muscular, especially the males, right? A male mountain lion can be over 200 pounds. So alone, yes, a wolf can occasionally fall prey to mountain lions. And the other thing to emphasize is that, of course, wolves react to humans like we're their predator, right? So we are a predator for so many other predators, which has led humans to label us as a super predator, a predator that preys on other big predators. Another example of a super predator is the killer whale, which is known to prey on great white sharks. So we're not the only one.
Well, it looks like
I was able to work in 1 killer whales again.
Looks like your own domestic predator looking for its dinner. I see your own domestic predator is already prowling for some dinner, so maybe that's time to call it a day. I really appreciate you joining us and answering all our questions. We'll put this video up just a little bit later on so everybody can keep on enjoying it in the coming months. So your website is predatorecology.com. I guess that's a good place to go and find out more about your work and about your program. And
yes, that website details my work, the work of my grad students. It has a list of all the papers that we've published and our research partners and on and on. So if anybody's curious at all, please check it out.
Okay. Thank you very much, Aaron Wirsing.